Adventurer. It's the general term for players found in almost every tabletop RPG sourcebook, but what does it actually mean? It's a question that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and something I feel gets overlooked, even though it sits at the very core of what it means to play a TTRPG. We use it as a synonym for play a character, but being an adventurer isn't just a job title. We've been telling stories about people who leave home and go do something dangerous for pretty much all of recorded history, so that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. What does it mean to be an adventurer? We're going to go back, like medieval superstition back, trace this bad boy all the way through modern psychology, watch it get remixed across film and TV and video games, and make all of that useful GM advice. So grab yourself a beverage, kids, it's going to be a long one. To start, I think it's important to say that the word adventurer didn't always mean what we think it means. If we go back to 11th century France, the word aventure isn't about choosing danger, it's actually about what befalls you, fate, fortune, something that happens to you whether you like it or not. People at the time genuinely believed the universe was this huge clockwork thing, run by gods or fortune or providence, and your role in this was basically already scripted. So when a knight went off and had an adventure, it wasn't a vacation choice, it was their destiny. You didn't seek out adventure, adventure found you, and you just had to survive it with your honor intact. Then the Renaissance rolls around and things get interesting. Merchants and sailors start crossing oceans, and this is when an important shift starts to happen. They're not just throwing themselves at the mercy of the gods anymore, they're calculating odds, managing risks, and buying insurance. Basically, you get merchant adventurers like Shakespeare's Antonio in The Merchant of Venice, a guy whose whole identity is built around calculated risk on the high seas. Adventure stopped being something that just happened to you, and it became something that you actually planned for. But the real hinge point, the one that gave us that coined term of adventurer we use today, is Romanticism, 19th century. Before this, your classic heroes, your Odysseus types, your Robinson Crusoe, they all wanted to go home. The adventure was a detour, and unfortunate delay on the road back to normal life. The Romantics flipped that completely. They started treating adventure as an aesthetic choice, almost a moral one. This new figure shows up, the explorer who's terrified of conformity, who needs independence like oxygen, and they go looking for authenticity specifically by rebelling against the settled, ordered world, which then shifts all of this into unknown not being such a punishment, and instead it's like a life choice. It's where life happens, you know? And we see this play out with actual humans, not just fictional ones. Magellan's crew circling the entire globe, Lewis and Clark stumbling across a continent with barely a map. Sacagawea doing the genuinely hardest job in that whole expedition, being the cultural bridge between worlds that didn't trust each other. Shackleton's crew surviving on pack ice after their ship got crushed, and somehow every single one of them made it home. These are all real people who went out and did the thing, you know? And something that I find genuinely fascinating as someone who spends way too many hours thinking about why we play pretend at a table on a Tuesday night, the planet's basically all mapped out now. There's no more blank spots labeled "Here be dragons," so where does the romantic hunger go? Carl Jung had a word for it: individuation, the lifelong process of dragging the unconscious, unexamined parts of yourself up into the light and interrogating them into an actual whole self. We don't need new coastlines anymore, we need new frontiers in our own heads, our own relationships, or our own sense of who we are. Modern motivation research backs this up too. People are driven by autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The sense that you're choosing your own path, that you're actually good at something, and that you belong somewhere. Adventure at its core is the narrative script your brain uses to chase all three of those at once. The adventurer isn't just an adrenaline junkie. When you really think about it, they're walking a metaphor for the human need to grow. That's why the archetype refuses to die. It's not really about swords, and it never was. So that psychological drive, the individuation thing, it needed a delivery system, and humans being humans built about a dozen of them. The big one, the one you've probably heard referenced 1,000 times even if you've never read the book, is the monomyth, or the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell laid this out in 1949 in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, arguing there's basically one universal skeleton underneath myths, from from widely different, unconnected cultures. Campbell's original version had 17 stages, which is a lot, so Hollywood story consultant Christopher Vogler trimmed it down to something more usable, 12 steps that map surprisingly well onto actual psychological growth. So let's go through them. The first one is the ordinary world, the hero's comfortable, conditioned starting point. Think of your Bilbo in the Shire, pipe in hand, doilies on every surface. Then the call to adventure, the moment comfort quietly turns into confinement. And then the refusal of the call, the ego digs in, Luke telling Obi-Wan he can't go, he's got chores. Uncle Owen needs him at that farm. And then they meet the mentor, Gandalf, Yoda, Morpheus, whoever hands you the tools or the belief that you're missing. Then they cross that first threshold, the point of no return. You let go of the old identity, and then you test with allies and enemies, learning the rules of this new world the hard way. And then they approach to the inmost cave, closing in on the thing you've actually been avoiding this whole time. And then they go through an ordeal, a symbolic death or rebirth. Something in you has to break for something new to exist. And then they get a reward, the prize, but the real prize is almost always self-knowledge wearing a disguise. And then they take the road back, head home, and find out if the change actually stuck under pressure. And then the real climax, the resurrection, where wisdom gets tested against reality one more time at max stakes. And then they return with the elixir back into the ordinary world, permanently altered using what they've learned to actually help somebody. And before anyone rolls their eyes and calls this a boys club conquest narrative, go check out the oldest recorded versions of this whole structure. The Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent, it predates almost everything else we usually cite. And it's not about slaying a dragon, it's actually about descending, surrendering layer by layer, being stripped down and getting remade from the inside out. The heroine's journey, if you want to call it that. It has been sitting right there at the root of the whole tradition the entire time. Flamey, all that's great, but what's actually useful for us? Glad you asked, viewer. As people who sit behind a screen and run games, every medium bends this archetype into its own direction, and you can steal from all of them at once. Literature gives us interiority. Books let you sit inside of a character's doubt for pages at a time, and they lean in hard on what's sometimes called the imagination gap. The story tells you just enough and your brain fills in the rest, which is why the book is always scarier or sadder than the movie. Film gives you pacing and set pieces. Movies are ruthless about structure, 3 acts, clear goals, visible obstacles. Watch the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark again sometime. Within about 10 minutes, you know exactly who Indy is, what he wants, and what's in his way, entirely through action. Television gives you seriality, a slow burn ensemble growth. Shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender or Doctor Who prove you can wander through episodes without ever feeling aimless, partly through the bottle episode. Trap the cast in one location, strip away the spectacle, and suddenly you get the deepest character work in the whole series. And video games give you agency. This is the big one that's most relevant to us. Games run on something called the GFI framework, goals, feedback, interpretation. You set a goal, the system gives you feedback on your attempts, and you interpret what that means and adjust. From Zork in 1980 all the way through to environmental storytelling and Half-Life or Bioshock, games force the player to actually make the story happen through action, not just witness it. Something I think about when I sit down to run a session is that D&D is quietly symphonizing all 4 of these at once. You've got the novelistic interiority of playing a character with private motives, you've got the filmic action of combat with clear stakes, and the television seriality of a campaign that runs for months or years, and you've got the game-like agency of actual consequences for actual choices. No other medium does all 4 simultaneously, which is what makes it so unique and appealing. So how does this multi-thousand-year-old psychological pattern end up as a game you play with pizza-stained character sheets and a folding table? It started weirdly with war games. Early 1970s, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were running massive tabletop battles simulating medieval warfare. Gygax had written a rule set called Chainmail for exactly this kind of large-scale combat, and then Arneson did something that, looking back, seems obvious but at the time was genuinely radical. Instead of commanding an entire army, what if you controlled one person? He built a campaign called Blackmoor around this single idea. In 1974, Gygax and Arneson published the original Dungeons & Dragons, and suddenly the adventure, this archetype that had been floating around mythology and literature for millennia, had stats, alignment, hit points, classes, fighter, magic user, cleric. For the first time, an ordinary person at a kitchen table could project their own identity onto a character built built out of numbers and imagination, and watch that character grow. The game concept kept evolving right alongside this archetype it was built upon. AD&D in 2nd edition cracked open the genre after genre, the gothic horror of Ravenloft, the wild sci-fi fantasy of Spelljammer, the brutal post-apocalyptic wasteland of Dark Sun. The adventurer archetype turned out to be flexible enough to survive in basically any setting you dropped it into. 3rd edition brought in the unified D20 system and feats, giving players granular control over how their hero grew mechanically. You could actually see your character's arc represented in build choices. And then 4th edition leaned tactically, almost MMO flavored, with clear, defined combat roles: controller, striker, defender, leader. And then 5th edition pulled the pendulum back towards the story and accessibility, putting real weight on the backgrounds and roleplay, which, not a coincidence, is exactly what helped ignite the actual play boom we're living in now, where you got your critical roles and dimension 20s. D&D works at a mechanical level because it operationalizes adventure. The DM describes a situation, the players make a choice, the DM adjudicates what happens next. That loop, over and over, session after session, is the individuation cycle in miniature. It makes players feel competent when they succeed, autonomous when they choose, and connected when the party pulls together. Your character feels more like an extended self, a safe, consequence-free space to explore your identity you might not get to explore anywhere else in your life. And with all that in mind, let's put it all together and see what you can actually do with all of this at your table. A mistake I constantly made early on, and I still think a lot of other people make, is you watch something like Star Wars and read Lord of the Rings, and you try to get your players to reenact the plot beat for beat. This never works. It can't work. The second your players deviate even slightly, and they will, you're stuck either railroading them back onto the rails or improvising blind. That improvisation muscle comes from doing just that. It needs to be your story. There's nothing wrong with copy and pasting structures, just don't copy the plot. If you want the feel of Treasure Island, don't write out a script where the mutiny happens on schedule. Instead, hand your players a physical map, give them a ship, staff it with crew whose loyalty is genuinely in question, and put a rival faction on the same timeline racing them to the X. Use countdowns or clocks to represent the noose tightening. That way the pressure is visible and real, but the players are the ones deciding how to navigate it. The structure gives you the tension and the players give you the plot. And you need to make real moral dilemmas, not just fake ones. If your campaign's central moral choice is, do we kill the bad guy or let him live? That's not really a dilemma, that's a formality. A genuine moral dilemma isn't good versus evil, it's two competing goods where every path costs the party something real. This is the old philosophical tension between utilitarianism, do what helps the most people, full stop, and deontology. Some lines don't get crossed no matter what the math says. You don't need to lecture your players about Gantt, obviously, but you can build tension into the fiction directly. A quick example, a dam is about to fail. The flood water can be diverted one of two ways, not both. Send it towards the farmland and you wipe out the harvest. Famine, slow and grinding hits everyone. Or you can send it towards the industrial core instead, and you rupture the chemical stores, poisoning the river and drinking water for a generation. Slap both of these on the table and give your players the choice. There's never a clean answer, that's the whole point. You can steal this energy from The Witcher 3 too. Give players dirty hand dilemmas. The party needs information from a prisoner to stop an ambush before it happens. Do they use coercion? It'll probably work, but it will cost them something. A corruption, a reputation shift, an NPC who remembers exactly how this went down and treats them differently from now on. Let choices leave actual scars on your world that don't heal by next session. And then you need to let the room tell the story. Video games figured this out ages before tabletop caught up, and it's still underused at most tables. Stop having an old wizard in a tavern deliver your exposition in a monologue. Turn your players into the archaeologists instead. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the mind behind Dark Souls and Elden Ring, talked about how as a kid he couldn't read well, so he'd fill in gaps in books using just the pictures, and you can hear that instinct all over his games, which tell entire tragic backstories through item descriptions and environment detail instead of cutscenes. Do the same thing in your dungeons. Say you want your players to piece together that an assassin was the last person in this room. You don't need to narrate the whole thing, show it and let them do the work. There's a lockbox with a tricky latch shoved under the bed, scratches on the floorboards where it's been dragged out and back repeatedly, a drawer that carries a faint sharp smell. Tell them anyone taking a deep breath near it takes a point of poison damage. A blank sheet of parchment sitting next to a puddle of melted blue candle wax, quietly implying the ink is invisible. That's the GFI loop again: goals, feedback, interpretation, running life at your table, give clues, let the mechanics respond honestly, and let the players connect the dots themselves, which they figure out on their own. That immersion hits about 10 times harder than anything you could have just told them. And remember, the bottle episode is your friend. Combat in D&D is stressful by design. Every so often, you need to let the pressure valve open. Steal the TV's writer trick here. A bottle episode originally existed to save production money by limiting sets and casts, but the side effect is that it forces slow, close-up focus on character motives instead of a spectacle. Run one of these after a big fight, strand the party in a pocket dimension on a long sea crossing or snowed in a remote inn. Then give them nothing but low-stakes social terrain, a fancy ball to crash, or a town festival, a hunt for rare crafting materials that turns into 3 separate side conversations. Or just hand them a ridiculous low-stakes social litmus test. 2 NPCs are having a screaming argument because one wants to elope and run off with his girlfriend, but he's refusing to bring along her enormous gold-scaled pet goldfish. What do the players do? Mediate it? Adopt the fish? It sounds silly, and it is a little silly, but it forces roleplay without like a death clock running underneath it, and that's exactly what builds the bonds that make your next deadly encounter actually hit harder. Something that I just keep going back to every time I think it through is that adventure isn't just a fantasy trope we like because it's fun to roll dice. It's basically the human operating system for growth. Wearing a costume made of swords and dragons, every time your character walks out of that tavern, faces something that could kill them, gets forced into a choice with no clean answer and comes back changed. You're running the exact same cycle people have been telling each other stories about since before we had writing to write it down. And for me, once I understood where this whole archetype come from, medieval fate, through romantic rebellion and Campbell's monomyth, all the way down into the actual D20 sitting at your table right now, you can't just start building sessions that don't just entertain your players for 3 hours on game night. You need to build ones that actually land somewhere real. Give them autonomy, give their choices some real weight, and let consequences stick. And let me know in the comments if you found this video useful, if you look at adventures this way, or if it's something that you just breeze past because you just see it written in a book and think, yep, they're adventures. If you think about this a different way, let me know in the comments, and if you're a player who's experienced something like this, then let us know how it went. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay spicy, adventurers.